And that's our next question is what about that then? If it's so fantastically designed and was able to withstand all of this load, yet allow for motion because it's malleable and pliable, what about that structure then creates that it's potentially what's referred to as responsible for 40% of pain from the lumbar spine?
Well, let's step back with a simile for as a term of reference. Even in civil engineering, the same principle will apply. You can design and construct an elegant device. Let's use a bridge, a concrete bridge spanning over a river. And one could appreciate the elegance when it is designed and built well. But any beautiful structure can become unstable if components of its design are somehow impaired. And what we've seen of late in civil engineering is that old bridges are starting to fall down. What was it, about 5-10 years ago that something fell down in Italy? And it's because components like the steel cables that reinforce the concrete start to rust because tiny amounts of water got through and helped oxidize the steel cable. And I've seen a documentary where the engineers in London have had to go around and reinforce now aging bridges with new steel cable because the original ones are corroding. The principle that engineering example illustrates is tiny changes in certain components of an otherwise perfect structure lead to impaired function. And a small change can progressively lead to catastrophic changes because of the loss of the contribution of the affected component. So if we go back to the disc, sure, if you do something horrendous and tear an annulus fibrosus, it's no longer going to work well for you. But most commonly, if the nucleus stops bracing the annulus fibrosus, things will not work as they are supposed to. And it's relatively straightforward to compromise the nucleus pulposus by affecting its proteoglycans. If you tip the balance from synthesis to degradation, then the nucleus can no longer retain its water. And then it will not be able to exert sufficient pressure to prevent the annulus fibrosus from getting sloppy. And as the disc gets more and more sloppy, we end up with movements that occurred that were not supposed to occur. And we end up back at the story of instability. So the idea is small changes to some components of an elegant structure will lead to its failure. And the question that would then arise, well, what can affect the proteoglycans inside a nucleus pulposus that will compromise the function of the disc? People have talked about nutrition. So all you people that are smoking, well, you're doomed to have failure of your discs because you're starving them of nutrition. But the big example is compression injury. I don't take credit for that. It was the late Harry Farfan, who launched that concept and undertook work back in the 1980s on cadavers and trying to instill injuries into specimens. So he launched the concept of compression injury. And it's not difficult to injure a lumbar spine or one of its discs by everyday activities if the spine is not conditioned. Heavyweight weightlifters, if they've been trained well, develop really strong vertebrae, and they can sustain the weight. Your average sedentary worker who drives to work or sits on a train to go to work and has not been conditioned to taking large axial loads is susceptible to exceeding the threshold for injury of a disc. And the place where they fail is in the vertebral end plate. And the moment there's a tiny fracture in that end plate, the inside of the vertebral body meets the inside of the disc and things go wrong chemically. And that's the origin of the condition of internal disc disruption. You can't tell, we don't have means by telling when it started because we don't have tools that will detect the onset. But we see the later stages of internal disc disruption in the form of degradation of the nucleus and then the development of radial and circumferential fissures through the annulus fibrosus. And that's where the pathology meets the nerves, and that's where the pain starts. When we wrote the first edition of Clinical Anatomy, little was known about that. It was just an assertion. Diagnosis by imagination launched by Harry Farfan. But then people took animals and deliberately injured their vertebral end plates and followed them. And the processes that I have just described ensued in a deliberately injured end plate in an experimental animal. The nucleus degraded. Then things went wrong in the annulus fibrosus. When we developed MRI, we could see some of those features, but not all of them. But when you start injecting contrast medium into an afflicted disc, you can see fissures of various grades as that condition progresses. The poor disc that was originally perfectly designed gets a subtle chemical disturbance and it degrades. It does not degenerate. Degeneration is a separate process. It happens with age and is not symptomatic. But when it degrades, that's how it becomes symptomatic. And we've got people that are harvesting chemicals from inside the disc, and the chemicals are nasty. And then people looked at the nerves, and the nerves are not just in the outer third. In the afflicted disc, they are reaching deeply through the annulus and sometimes even to the nucleus, where they are bathed in noxious soup. And we can put names to those chemicals if we harvest them. So that example covers several of your questions. The one of elegance of design, and if it's so perfect, why does it fail? Because it only takes a little disturbance. We didn't know that for sure in the 1980s when Harry Farfan was starting all of this. But as the tools developed for us to see changes, detect changes, and then harvest tissues, and then somebody is brave enough to get a ethics approval to take a pig and break its vertebral end plate very subtly, we got all the elements. And in an interview, I can't go through all the data, but I put it into the book of how we have progressed from an idea to the best studied and best understood pathology that applies to back pain. We made it in animals. We can detect it in people. Engineers have put pressure transducers into discs that have internal disc disruption and can show you that they don't work properly. And what they show is not something that can be faked by a malingering patient who obviously has no pathoanatomical basis for their complaint. I defy you to be able to deliberately change the stress profile of the inside of your disc. It's objective data. So we have biomechanics, bioengineering, chemistry, physiology, animal experiments, radiology that all converge on the same story. Over.
Hear the entire episode for free on iTunes, Spotify,
other favorite podcast players, or go to mechanicalcareforum.com.